In this paper, we were looking at the Clean Air Act and the effect of the Clean Air Act on the employment-based sensitivity. The existing literature primarily focuses on industrial impacts of the Clean Air Act. So how does the Clean Air Act impact particularly polluting industries? The regulatory effects on local economies are largely unknown. The local economic sensitivity to changes in the national economy is an indicator of local economic performance. And so this paper fills in that gap, addressing what is the impact of this federal environmental regulation from a local perspective? What is the impact on residents of a particular area? Focusing on the Clean Air Act gives us an opportunity to look at federal environmental regulations. This is a key environmental regulation at the federal level, and so we are able to look at the impact of this federal environmental regulation and how it shapes local economies. This allows states and local policymakers to anticipate the effects of the Clean Air Act and be able to plan for appropriate economic development efforts in response to these impacts. Also, looking at the Clean Air Act and the impacts on the local employment-based sensitivity provides a framework for evaluating the economic development impacts of other federal regulations. We are addressing two central research questions. First, how do non-attainment regulations alter the sensitivity of the local employment base to the business cycle? And then secondly, do these effects persist after attainment status has been regained? As we look at this, we need to step back and think about how diversification affects stability, because that is an important issue that is intertwined with the Clean Air Act impacts. So in general, we see that diversification does have an effect on economic stability. Business cycles affect different industries differently, and so we need to make sure we're taking into consideration the impact of this diversification on economic stability. In this paper, we discuss how the Clean Air Act has a direct impact on industrial diversification, and that impact on industrial diversification in turn has an impact on employment sensitivity. This is in addition to the Clean Air Act impacts direct impact on employment sensitivity at the local level. The way that we measure diversification is that we use the coefficient of specialization, the CDIV. This is a metric where a value of 0 indicates the local diversification mirrors what we see at the national level, and a value of 1 indicates a highly specialized local economy. What we need to do in our study is to isolate the impact of the Clean Air Act on industrial diversification and separate that out from other industrial diversification that can impact employment sensitivity. And so we regress the CDIV on the Clean Air Act regulatory status. The residuals from that regression are orthogonal to the Clean Air Act regulatory status. What this allows us to do is control for diversification that is unrelated to the Clean Air Act. And so we're able to isolate industrial diversification that is a result of the Clean Air Act and capture that in addition to the Clean Air Act's direct impact on employment sensitivity. As we think about employment sensitivity, the way we measure this is we capture the elasticity of each industrial sector at the local level, and then we weight that by the prevalence of that sector in the local economy. The Clean Air Act regulates criteria pollutants, and these regulations affect a significant number of counties nationwide. In the study, we are looking at ground level ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. We chose these because these particular criteria pollutants do affect a significant number of counties nationwide. The EPA determines the attainment status for each county. The potential status for a county is that the county or a particular area can be in attainment with those criteria pollutant ambient air quality standards. They can be out of attainment or in non-attainment. Once an area has been in non-attainment and additional regulations have been applied, ideally the air quality will improve. Once it improves, attainment status can be regained. But that regained attainment status is different from the original attainment status. There is a statewide maintenance plan that is required to be implemented. And the idea of this is to maintain air quality. We don't want a community to improve the air quality and then go back to what they were doing before and the air quality deteriorates again. And so once an area has regained attainment status, the regulatory environment is not identical to what it was before non-attainment. There are some additional regulations put in place to maintain that cleaner air quality. In our model, we also interact attainment status with the number of years that that status has been in place. And so we want to capture how quickly do we see a response to these attainment or non-attainment regulations. In our study, we apply a difference in differences model. And what we do is we run a separate model for each criteria pollutant, because we expect these regulations are going to be different based on the criteria pollutant that is being regulated. Also, we are very careful in how we identify our control observations. We run one set of models for non-attainment status. So what is the impact of having non-attainment for one of these criteria pollutants? The control group that we're comparing these non-attainment counties to are counties that have always been in attainment. So in other words, what happens when a county goes from being in attainment to switching to non-attainment? And how does that make that county different from counties that have never experienced those non-attainment regulations? We run another set of models for counties that have regained attainment status. So what this allows us to do is capture counties that were in non-attainment but have since regained attainment status, and we see these maintenance regulations being applied. The control in this case is counties that are always in non-attainment. So what we want to know is, does regaining attainment status make a county different from a county that has always been in non-attainment? Or are those two groups indistinguishable, meaning that those effects of non-attainment persist through regaining attainment status? Finally, we applied Corson exact matching to our data. The purpose of matching is that adding control observations should not alter the results of your empirical analysis. However, that can occur if the observations that you're adding for your control group are fundamentally different in nature from your treatment observations. So for example, Los Angeles County, California has a population of over 10 million people. Alpine County in California has a population of just over 1,200 people. There are fundamental differences between those two counties, and it would not make sense to compare Los Angeles County to Alpine County. There are very different things going on. And so this matching allows us to make sure we are having meaningful comparisons between counties. In our study, we find that there is no statistical effect for non-attainment for particulate matter. And this is likely because particulates are emitted from a very broad range of industries. So for example, construction, agriculture, industrial processes, fuel combustion, all of these are different sources for particulate matter. And regulations applied to particulate matter are going to have a very broad impact, and it's not going to have as much of a specific impact on any particular industries. Ground level ozone is a different story. Ground level ozone is emitted by a smaller set of industries. We find that during the first year of non-attainment, a non-attainment for ground level ozone reduces employment sensitivity by 18.4% of a standard deviation. So we do see a significant effect here. And more importantly, this effect persists for decades after that initial non-attainment classification. So again, in contrast to particulate matter, ground level ozone is the result of specific economic activities. So for example, fuel combustion, particularly for electric generation and industrial purposes, is a significant contributor to ground level ozone. We expect that this is driven by a reduction in industrial specialization. This reduction of employment in industries that are highly responsive to the national economy, such as energy and large industrial facilities, is going to be driving this effect. We see the greatest regulatory effect for sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is very narrow in scope in terms of the polluting industry. So predominantly coal and oil-fired power plants are emitting sulfur dioxide. So the non-attainment regulations targeting sulfur dioxide are going to be targeting a small number of polluting industries. We do not observe a regulatory effect for the first 25 years of non-attainment. At 25 years of sulfur dioxide non-attainment, we do see a reduction in employment sensitivity of 24% of one standard deviation, and then this continues to increase. After 40 years of sulfur dioxide non-attainment, we see a reduction in employment sensitivity greater than 43% of a standard deviation. So we do see significant impacts for sulfur dioxide. Large power plants and industrial facilities, large power plants and industrial facilities are slow to relocate production. We also saw tradable SO2 permits, tradable sulfur dioxide permits in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. This provided power plants some additional flexibility that would reduce pressure to relocate. However, there were still higher costs associated with these polluting facilities. This is going to have an impact on long-term investment decisions. So we don't see an impact for the first few decades, but then we start to see major effects for non-attainment regulations on sulfur dioxide. We then looked in our study as to whether these effects persist after attainment status has been regained and those maintenance regulations are put into place. And we do find that these effects persist beyond non-attainment. We do not see any statistical difference between the counties that have regained attainment status and those that are still in non-attainment. And so what that tells us is that these non-attainment regulations that are designed to maintain air quality are also maintaining the changes in the local economy. The literature has been relatively silent on the effects of non-attainment status after attainment status has been regained. The whole idea of regaining attainment status and putting maintenance regulations into place is to maintain that improved air quality. But then we should also anticipate that there's at least a good chance that some of these regulatory impacts will persist as well. And in the case of these non-attainment regulations being replaced with maintenance regulations, we do see a persistent effect on employment-based sensitivity. As we consider the policy implications of this study, we see that non-attainment for ground level ozone and sulfur dioxide is significant, that we do see a significant impact on employment-based sensitivity. We observe a reduced sensitivity to the national business cycle. However, local communities may experience a reduction in wages and higher unemployment during the transition as the local economy adjusts. When facing non-attainment for ground level ozone or sulfur dioxide, there is a call for proactive economic development policies that will anticipate the economic shifts in response to non-attainment status. There's a need to encourage diversification and a need to assist workers as they change industries. There's an immediate impact for regulations focusing on ground level ozone. So if a community is in non-attainment for ground level ozone, there's a need for quick economic development action. When sulfur dioxide is being regulated for a non-attainment county or a non-attainment area, we see long-term impacts for sulfur dioxide non-attainment. These impacts are not immediate, but eventually these impacts are significant. So communities do have longer to plan for these impacts, but that planning does need to begin and does need to anticipate significant impacts.